Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. In the summer of 1922, when the world was still healing from the Great War and America was wrestling with the shadows of Prohibition, something happened in the remote hollows of the Ozark Mountains that would haunt the region for generations to come. It was a story that began with the simple joy of a family picnic and ended in a mystery so profound that it still echoes through the mist-covered valleys today. The date was July 15, 1922. The Dawson family, Edward, his wife Lillian, and their two children Harold and Margaret, left their modest farmhouse near Mountain View, Missouri, for what should have been an ordinary Sunday afternoon in the wilderness. They packed their wicker baskets with care, filled mason jars with fresh lemonade, and loaded their wagon with quilts and provisions for a day of peace beneath the ancient oaks that dotted the Ozark landscape. They were never seen alive again. What makes this disappearance so deeply unsettling isn't just the fact that an entire family vanished without a trace. It's the eerie circumstances that surrounded their fate. The way their picnic was found days later, perfectly arranged as if they had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return. The food was laid out on checkered cloth, the lemonade still sweet in its jars, the blankets spread just so beneath the dappled shade of towering trees. It was as if time itself had stopped in that forgotten corner of the wilderness, preserving a moment of domestic tranquility, while the family who created it had been erased from existence. The local newspaper, the Howell County Gazette, would later describe the scene with words that sent chills through every household in the region. The picnic setting remained undisturbed, as though the family had been called away by some silent summons, leaving behind only the ghost of their presence and the terrible question of where they had gone. But to understand the full horror of what happened to the Dawsons, we must first understand the world they inhabited. A world caught between the innocence of rural tradition and the dark undercurrents of a changing America. The Ozark Mountains in 1922 were a place where ancient superstitions lived alongside modern fears, where the end of one war had given birth to new kinds of violence, and where the federal government's attempt to legislate morality had created opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law. The Ozarks of the early 1920s were a landscape painted in contradictions. On the surface, these rolling hills and hidden valleys represented the America that many people longed to preserve. A place where families still gathered on front porches in the evening, where neighbors knew each other's names and troubles, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons rather than the factory whistle. Towns like Mountain View, Willow Springs, and West Plains were connected by dusty roads that wound through forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. This was a region where the Civil War was still a living memory, where elderly men gathered at the general store to argue about battles their fathers had fought, and where the scars of that conflict had created pockets of mistrust that lingered like morning fog in the hollows. The people who called these mountains home were largely self-sufficient, growing their own food, making their own clothes, and handling their own problems with minimal interference from the outside world. But the outside world had a way of intruding, even into the most remote corners of the Ozarks. The Great War had taken young men from these hills and returned them changed, if it returned them at all. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had swept through communities that had thought themselves isolated from such modern plagues. And now, in 1922, the federal government's grand experiment in moral legislation, Prohibition, was creating new tensions and new opportunities for those bold enough or desperate enough to seize them. The 18th Amendment had officially banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, but it had not eliminated the demand for them. In the Ozarks, with their maze-like valleys, hidden caves, and long tradition of independence from federal authority, conditions were perfect for the establishment of illegal distilleries. The same geographic features that had once hidden Civil War guerrillas now concealed moonshine operations, and the same fierce independence that had resisted outside interference now fueled a profitable resistance to federal law. By 1922, the mountains were honeycombed with hidden stills, their smoke rising like incense from forgotten valleys. The clear, cold springs that bubbled up from limestone caves provided perfect water for distilling, while the dense forests offered both concealment and an endless supply of fuel. Federal agents, known locally as revenuers, made periodic raids into the region, but they were vastly outnumbered and often outmaneuvered by locals who knew every cave, every hidden trail, every secret passage through the wilderness. This cat-and-mouse game between federal law enforcement and local moonshiners created an atmosphere of constant tension. Farmers who had never broken a law in their lives found themselves caught between their traditional way of life and the new federal regulation. Some chose to cooperate with the authorities, earning the resentment of their neighbors. Others provided support, willing or unwilling, to the illegal operations, living in fear of both federal raids and retribution from the criminals they reluctantly harbored. The violence that accompanied this underground economy was swift and brutal. Men who crossed the wrong people simply disappeared, their bodies never found in the vast wilderness. Families who asked too many questions or saw too much found their barns mysteriously burned, their livestock killed, their wells poisoned. The mountains that had once been a refuge from the complexities of modern life had become a place where ancient codes of honor and modern criminal enterprise created a deadly mixture. Into this volatile world, the federal government had dispatched agents with broad powers and little understanding of local conditions. These men, many of them from cities in the East, were tasked with enforcing laws that much of the local population viewed as illegitimate. They operated with the backing of federal authority, but without the benefit of local knowledge, making them both powerful and vulnerable. Some were honest men trying to do their duty. Others were corrupt officials who saw prohibition enforcement as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The result was a climate of suspicion and fear that permeated every aspect of life in the Ozarks. Neighbors watched neighbors, wondering who might be involved in illegal activities and who might be reporting to the authorities. Strangers were viewed with deep suspicion, and even longtime residents could find themselves ostracized if they fell under suspicion of being informants or federal sympathizers. It was against this backdrop of social upheaval and hidden violence that the Dawson family lived their quiet lives. Like most of their neighbors, they were hard-working people who wanted nothing more than to farm their land, raise their children, and live in peace. But in the summer of 1922, peace was a rare commodity in the Ozark Mountains, and the Dawsons were about to discover just how fragile their quiet existence really was. The family that would become the center of one of the region's most enduring mysteries was, by all accounts, remarkably ordinary. Edward Dawson was 42 years old in the summer of 1922, a man whose hands bore the calluses of honest labor and whose weathered face reflected decades of outdoor work. He had been born in these mountains, the son of a farmer who had worked the same rocky soil that Edward now called his own. Those who knew him described him as a quiet man, neither given to boasting nor to complaining, someone who measured his words carefully and kept his own counsel. Edward had served briefly in the Spanish-American War, though he rarely spoke of his experiences. Like many men of his generation, He had seen enough of violence and conflict to appreciate the simple pleasures of peaceful living. He was known as a man who paid his debts, kept his word, and minded his own business, qualities that were highly valued in a community where trust was both essential and fragile. His wife, Lillian, was 38 years old and had spent her entire life in the Ozarks. Born Lillian May Carter, she had grown up in a family that traced its roots back to the earliest settlers in the region. She was known for her skill with a needle, her way with medicinal herbs, and her ability to make something from nothing, talents that were essential for survival in the hardscrabble world of Ozark farming. Neighbors remembered her as a woman who could birth a calf, preserve a harvest, and nurse a sick child with equal competence. Lillian was also known for her deep religious faith, a characteristic she shared with many women of her time and place. She was a regular attendee at the small Baptist church that served their community, and her voice could often be heard leading hymns during Sunday services. This faith would become particularly significant in the aftermath of the family's disappearance, as some in the community would interpret their fate through the lens of divine judgment or spiritual warfare. The Dawson children were Harold, aged 14, and Margaret, aged 10. Harold was already showing signs of becoming the kind of man his father was, serious, hard-working, and reliable beyond his years. He had been helping with the farm work since he was old enough to hold a hoe, and neighbors often commented on his maturity and sense of responsibility. He was the kind of boy who would grow up to be a pillar of the community, assuming he had been given the chance to grow up. Margaret was still very much a child in the summer of 1922, but she was already displaying the independence and strength that characterized the women of her family. She could milk a cow, gather eggs, and help with the cooking, but she also had a playful spirit that delighted in the simple pleasures of childhood, collecting wildflowers, chasing butterflies, and listening to her mother's stories about the old days. The Dawson farm was located about 3 miles southeast of Mountain View, in a valley that the locals called Dawson Hollow, though whether the hollow was named for the family or the family had taken its name from. The hollow was a matter of some debate among the older residents. The farmhouse itself was a modest structure, built of logs cut from the surrounding forest and chinked with mud and moss. It had 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen and a sitting room, and a loft where the children slept. The farm consisted of about 40 acres of mixed woodland and cleared fields, typical for the region. Edward grew corn, beans, and tobacco, and kept a small herd of cattle and some pigs. Like most Ozark farmers, the family lived largely off what they could produce themselves, supplementing their diet with wild game, fish from the nearby streams, and the abundant wild foods that the forest provided. The Dawsons were neither wealthy nor poor by the standards of their community. They had enough to eat, clothes to wear, and a roof over their heads, but there was little left over for luxuries. Edward owned his land free and clear, having inherited it from his father, which put the family in a better position than many of their neighbors who were still paying off mortgages or working as tenant farmers. What set the Dawsons apart, if anything did, was their reputation for reliability and their tendency to avoid the various conflicts and controversies that periodically swept through the community. Edward was not known to drink, which kept him clear of the moonshine trade that was causing so much trouble in the region. The family attended church regularly, but avoided the theological disputes that sometimes split congregations. They were helpful neighbors, but not gossips, friendly, but not intrusive. This reputation for stability and discretion may have been what ultimately led to their doom. In a time and place where neutrality was often viewed with suspicion, the Dawsons' determination to mind their own business may have been interpreted by some as a sign that they were hiding something. Or perhaps their very ordinariness made them perfect targets for those who needed to send a message without arousing too much attention. The hollow where the Dawsons lived was not an isolated place, despite its rural character. Several other families lived within a few miles, and the main road to Mountain View passed close enough that the sound of wagons and occasional automobiles could be heard. RD from the farmhouse. But it was also a place where someone could disappear without immediate notice, where the thick forests and hidden valleys could swallow secrets as effectively as they swallowed the morning mist. Local folklore had long held that Dawson Hollow was a place touched by something beyond the ordinary world. Old-timers spoke of strange lights seen dancing among the trees on moonless nights, of voices heard calling from empty woods, of livestock found dead with no apparent cause. Some attributed these phenomena to the restless spirits of Cherokee Indians who had once lived in the area. Others blamed them on more recent ghosts, the unquiet dead of the Civil War or the victims of more contemporary violence. Whether Edward and Lillian Dawson believed in such stories is unknown, but they would have been familiar with them. In a culture where superstition and practicality existed side by side, most people took a cautious approach to the unexplained. They might not fully believe the old stories, but they saw no harm in avoiding places and situations that had acquired unsavory reputations. It was from this world of hard work and hidden dangers, of ancient superstitions and modern conflicts, that the Dawson family set out on their final journey. They left behind a life that was simple but not easy, ordinary but not safe, familiar but shot through with uncertainties that reflected the troubled times in which they lived. The morning of July 15, 1922, dawned clear and warm, with the kind of summer weather that made the Ozark Mountains seem like paradise on earth. The air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle and wild roses, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak and hickory trees that covered the hillsides. It was the perfect day for a family outing, the kind of day that seemed designed for making memories. Lillian Dawson had been planning this picnic for weeks, ever since Edward had finished the last of the spring planting and could afford to take a day away from the constant demands of farm work. She had been saving eggs and milk to make a special cake, had preserved extra vegetables from their garden, and had even managed to purchase some store-bought cheese from the general store in Mountain View, a rare extravagance that spoke to how much this outing meant to her. The family rose early that morning, as was their custom, but there was an air of excitement that distinguished this day from their usual routine. Margaret could barely contain her enthusiasm, chattering about all the things they would do and see during their adventure. Harold, though trying to maintain his usual serious demeanor, was clearly looking forward to a day away from his regular chores. Even Edward, normally focused on the practical concerns of farm life, seemed more relaxed than usual. Lillian packed their food with the same care she brought to all her domestic tasks. She wrapped slices of ham in clean cloth, filled mason jars with fresh lemonade, and packed her special cake in a tin that had been a wedding gift years earlier. She included hard-boiled eggs, fresh bread, butter churned just the day before, and some of the wild strawberry preserves she had made earlier in the summer. It was a feast by their standards, a celebration of abundance in a life that usually required careful attention to every resource. The family loaded their supplies into the wagon that Edward used for trips to town, the same sturdy vehicle that had carried them to church, to market, and on the few other excursions they allowed themselves. Edward hitched up their best horse, a gentle mare named Belle, who had been with the family for over a decade. Belle was getting old, but she was still reliable for local trips, and her calm temperament made her perfect for family outings. The destination they had chosen was a spot along Jack's Fork River, about 5 miles from their home. It was a place Edward had known since childhood, a bend in the river where the water ran clear and shallow over a bed of smooth stones, shaded by ancient trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral. There were pools deep enough for wading, flat rocks perfect for laying out a picnic, and enough privacy to allow a family to feel like they had the whole world to themselves. The route to their chosen spot took them along roads that were little more than dirt tracks winding through the forest. These were paths that had been carved by generations of travelers, deepened by countless wagon wheels, and maintained by the informal cooperation of all who used them. They passed familiar landmarks, a lightning-struck oak that served as a boundary marker, a spring where travelers traditionally stopped to water their horses, a clearing where Cherokee artifacts were sometimes found after heavy rains. As they traveled, Edward and Lillian pointed out features of the landscape to their children, sharing the kind of local knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. They identified the calls of different birds, explained which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided, and told stories about the history of the places they passed. It was both education and entertainment, the kind of informal schooling that was essential for survival in their world. The journey took them through country that was beautiful, but also potentially dangerous. These same woods that looked so peaceful in the morning sunlight could hide any number of threats: wild animals, dangerous terrain, and increasingly, the human predators who had made the region their hunting ground. But on this perfect summer morning, with the sun filtery, through the leaves and the sound of birdsong filling the air, such concerns seemed distant and unreal. They reached their destination around midday, when the sun was high enough to warm the air, but the shade was still cool and inviting. Edward unhitched Belle and let her graze in a nearby meadow, while Lillian and the children began to unpack their supplies. They spread their quilts on a flat area near the water's edge, arranged their food on the checkered cloth that Lillian had brought for the purpose, and settled in to enjoy their meal. For a few hours, the Dawson family experienced the kind of perfect happiness that comes so rarely in life. They ate their carefully prepared meal, waded in the cool water of the river, and simply enjoyed being together in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Harold skipped stones across the water, while Margaret collected interesting rocks and wildflowers. Edward and Lillian sat in the shade, talking quietly and watching their children play. It was during these peaceful hours that something happened, something that would transform a perfect family outing into one of the most baffling mysteries in the history of the Ozark Mountains. The exact nature of what occurred may never be known, but the evidence suggests that it happened quickly and without warning, catching the family completely off guard. The first sign that something was wrong came when Belle, the family horse, returned to the Dawson farm alone the next morning. The mare was still wearing her harness, but the wagon was nowhere to be seen. She appeared to be uninjured, but she was clearly distressed, pacing nervously in the farmyard and whinnying as if trying to communicate something she couldn't express. When neighbors noticed Belle's return without the family, they initially assumed that the wagon had broken down and that Edward was walking home to get help. This was not an uncommon occurrence in a time when mechanical failures were frequent and repair services were non-existent. But as the hours passed and no word came from the Dawsons, concern began to grow. By evening, a small group of neighbors had decided to ride out to Jack's Fork River to check on the family. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The wagon was still parked where Edward had left it, but it was empty except for a few items that had apparently been overlooked. The picnic site was exactly as Lillian had arranged it. The quilts spread neatly, the food laid out as if the family had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no sign of the Dawsons themselves. The scene was so perfectly preserved, so undisturbed, that it seemed almost supernatural. The lemonade was still in its jars, though it had grown warm in the afternoon sun. The cake sat untouched on its tin, protected by the cloth Lillian had spread over it. Even the wildflowers that Margaret had picked were still arranged in a small bouquet beside her mother's place on the quilt. It was as if the family had simply vanished into the air, leaving behind only the material evidence of their presence and the terrible silence of their absence. The neighbors who discovered the scene stood in stunned bewilderment, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. In a world where tragedy was usually violent and obvious, this quiet disappearance was deeply unsettling. They called out for the Dawsons, their voices echoing off the water and returning to them without answer. They searched the immediate area, looking for any sign of what might have happened. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything that might provide a clue. But the forest revealed nothing, keeping its secrets as effectively as it had always done. As darkness fell, the neighbors realized that they were facing something beyond their ability to handle. They carefully gathered up the Dawsons' belongings, loaded them into the wagon, and led Belle back home, their minds reeling with questions for which they had no answers. They had found a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their world and their place in it. Word of the Dawsons' disappearance spread through the community like wildfire, carried by neighbors who had witnessed the eerie picnic site and by others who had simply heard the story secondhand. By the morning of July 17th, barely 2 days after the family had left for their outing, virtually everyone in the Mountain View area knew that something terrible had happened. The initial response was swift and comprehensive, reflecting both the close-knit nature of the community and the deep concern that the disappearance had generated. Sheriff J.R. Kelly of Howell County was contacted before dawn, and by sunrise he was riding toward the Dawson farm with a small posse of deputies and volunteers. These were men who knew the country intimately, who had grown up hunting and fishing in the same woods where the Dawsons had vanished. Sheriff Kelly was a man well-suited to handle the crisis that was developing. He had been born and raised in the Ozarks, had served as a deputy for over a decade before being elected sheriff, and was known for his combination of common sense and determination. He was also one of the few local law enforcement officials who had experience dealing with the federal agents who were increasingly active in the region, giving him insights into the kinds of violence that prohibition enforcement had brought to the mountains. The sheriff's first priority was to examine the scene where the Dawsons had disappeared, hoping to find clues that the neighbors had missed in the gathering darkness of the previous evening. What he found there only deepened the mystery. The picnic site remained exactly as it had been described, perfectly preserved, as if frozen in time. But Kelly's trained eye noticed details that had escaped the attention of the earlier searchers. The arrangement of the food and belongings was almost too perfect, too neat, as if someone had deliberately staged the scene. The quilts were spread without a wrinkle. The food was arranged with a precision that seemed unlikely if the family had been eating and moving around. Most disturbing of all, there were no signs of a struggle, no indication that the Dawsons had resisted whatever had happened to them. Kelly and his men began a systematic search of the area, looking for any trace of the missing family. They examined every inch of ground around the picnic site, searching for footprints, disturbed vegetation, or any other sign of what might have occurred. They found tracks left by the neighbors who had discovered the scene, and they found the impressions left by the Dawsons' own activities, but nothing that explained where the family had gone or what had happened to them. The search expanded outward from the picnic site in concentric circles, with teams of volunteers covering every possible route the Dawsons might have taken. They followed game trails through the dense forest, explored the numerous caves that honeycomb the region, and searched along the banks of Jack's Fork River and its tributaries. They called the families names until their voices were hoarse, hoping against hope to hear some response from the wilderness. As the search continued, more volunteers arrived from throughout the region. Word of the disappearance had spread beyond Howell County, carried by traveling merchants, mail carriers, and the informal networks of communication that connected rural communities. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their stores, and even some of the federal agents who were operating in the area joined the search effort. The response was remarkable in its scope and intensity, reflecting not only concern for the Dawson family, but also the deep unease that their disappearance had created throughout the region. In a world where danger was usually visible and explicable, this quiet vanishing seemed to threaten the fundamental assumptions on which people based their lives. If a family could simply disappear while engaged in such an innocent activity as a picnic, then nowhere was truly safe. The search parties used techniques that had been developed over generations of hunting and tracking in the Ozark wilderness. They followed the traditional methods of woodcraft, reading sign in disturbed leaves, broken twigs, and displaced stones. They also employed more organized approaches, dividing the search area into sectors and conducting systematic sweeps designed to ensure that no area was overlooked. But despite their expertise and their determination, the searchers found nothing. The forest seemed to have swallowed the Dawson family without leaving the slightest trace of their fate. It was as if they had walked into the wilderness and been absorbed by it, becoming part of the very landscape that had sustained and sheltered their ancestors for generations. As the days passed and the search continued to yield no results, the atmosphere in the region began to change. The initial sense of urgency and hope gradually gave way to a growing awareness that the Dawsons were probably dead, that the family had somehow fallen victim to one of the many dangers that lurked in the Ozark wilderness. But even this grim acceptance brought no peace of mind, because without bodies or evidence of what had happened, the community was left to wrestle with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing. The impact of this uncertainty extended far beyond the immediate families and friends of the Dawsons. Children who had played bidil with Harold and Margaret were haunted by nightmares, imagining the terrible fate that might have befallen their friends. Adults who had known Edward and Lillian found themselves looking over their shoulders when they walked in the woods, wondering if the same mysterious force that had claimed the Dawsons might be waiting for them as well. The investigation took on a more formal character as Sheriff Kelly began to consider the possibility that the disappearance was not the result of an accident or an encounter with wild animals, but rather the work of human predators. This suspicion was reinforced by the increasing reports of violence associated with the illegal liquor trade, and by the knowledge that the area where the Dawsons had vanished was not far from known moonshine operations. As the search entered its second week, additional resources were brought to bear on the investigation. Officers from the Missouri State Police were called in to assist with the effort, bringing with them techniques and equipment that were not available to local law enforcement. Federal agents, who had initially been viewed with suspicion by the local community, were welcomed as potential sources of help in solving the mystery. But even with these additional resources, the investigation made little progress. The federal agents brought their own theories about what might have happened, theories that reflected their focus on the illegal activities that prohibition had spawned throughout the region. They suggested that the Dawsons might have witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, or that they might have been mistaken for federal informants by criminals who were growing increasingly paranoid about law enforcement penetration of their operations. These theories, while plausible, could not be proven without evidence, and evidence remained frustratingly elusive. The wilderness that had claimed the Dawson family seemed determined to keep its secrets, offering up no clues to the investigators who combed through it with increasing desperation. By the time the official search was called off after 3 weeks of intensive effort, the disappearance of the Dawson family had become something more than a local tragedy. It had become a symbol of the uncertainty and fear that characterized life in the Ozarks during the turbulent years of the early 1920s. A reminder that in a world where traditional authorities were being challenged and new forms of violence were emerging, even the most innocent activities could lead to disaster. As the official search efforts wound down, the discovery of new evidence began to paint an even more disturbing picture of what might have happened to the Dawson family. These finds, scattered across the rugged landscape of the Ozarks over the course of several weeks, seemed to tell a story of terror and violence that was far removed from the peaceful picnic scene that had been found at Jack's Fork River. The first significant discovery came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the official search had been suspended, a young boy named Tommy Fletcher was hunting rabbits in a wooded area about 2 miles northeast of the original picnic site when he came across something that made his blood run cold. Half buried under a pile of leaves and forest debris was a blanket that had clearly been damaged by fire. The fabric was partially burned, with charred edges and holes that suggested it had been deliberately destroyed. Tommy's father, recognizing the potential significance of the find, immediately contacted Sheriff Kelly. When the sheriff examined the blanket, he was able to confirm that it matched the description of one of the quilts that Lillian Dawson had packed for the family's picnic. The pattern was distinctive, a double wedding ring design in blue and white that Lillian had sewn herself, and several neighbors who had known the family well were able to positively identify it. But the condition of the blanket raised more questions than it answered. Why had it been burned? Who had carried it more than 2 miles from the picnic site? And why had it been hidden under debris rather than simply discarded? The sheriff and his deputies conducted an intensive search of the area where the blanket had been found, but they discovered nothing else that could shed light on what had happened. 2 weeks later, an even more disturbing discovery was made near Blanchard Springs Caverns, a network of limestone caves that was well known to locals as both a natural wonder and a place where dangerous people sometimes hid from the law. A family of tourists from Springfield, exploring the area around the cave entrance, found a small pair of shoes that had been placed carefully on a flat rock near the water's edge. The shoes were immediately recognized as belonging to Margaret Dawson. They were small, black leather shoes with decorative buttons, the kind of Sunday shoes that a 10-year-old girl would wear for special occasions. But what made the discovery particularly unsettling was the way the shoes had been arranged. They were placed side by side, as if they had been removed carefully and deliberately positioned on the rock. The laces were still tied, suggesting that they had been pulled off Margaret's feet rather than untied in the normal fashion. Sheriff Kelly and a team of deputies immediately traveled to Blanchard Springs to investigate this new evidence. They found the shoes exactly as described, and they conducted an exhaustive search of the cave system and the surrounding area. But once again, they found nothing else that could explain what had happened to the Dawson family or how Margaret's shoes had come to be at this location. The discovery of the shoes had a profound impact on the community. The careful arrangement of the footwear suggested a level of deliberation and perhaps ritual significance that was deeply disturbing. Some residents began to whisper about cult activities or devil worship, while others suggested that the shoes had been placed there as a message or warning. The fact that they had been found near one of the region's most famous caves only added to the sense of unease that was spreading throughout the Ozarks. As summer turned to autumn, more strange discoveries were made throughout the region. A farmer near 11 Point River found Harold Dawson's straw hat caught in the branches of a tree that overhung the water as if it had been thrown there or dropped from a great height. The hat was undamaged, but its location, more than 10 miles from the original picnic site, suggested that Harold had traveled a considerable distance from where his family had disappeared. Another farmer, working in his fields near the small community of Alton, discovered what appeared to be fragments of a mason jar that matched the description of the containers Lillian had used to carry lemonade on the family's final outing. The glass fragments were scattered across a wide area, as if the jar had been deliberately smashed, and they were mixed with what appeared to be dried blood, though testing of the samples proved inconclusive. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery made by a group of hunters in a remote valley known locally as Devil's Den. They found the remains of a campfire that appeared to be relatively recent, surrounded by what looked like the remnants of a hastily abandoned camp. Among the debris were scraps of cloth that matched the fabric of Edward Dawson's work shirt, along with several items that could have come from the family's picnic supplies. But the campfire site also contained evidence of activities that had nothing to do with the Dawsons' innocent outing. There were the remains of a crude still, suggesting that the location had been used for illegal alcohol production. There were also signs that suggested the site had been used for other, more disturbing purposes. Arrangements of stones that seemed to have ritual significance and stains on the rocks around the fire that could have been blood. Each of these discoveries was investigated thoroughly by Sheriff Kelly and his deputies, often with the assistance of federal agents who were increasingly convinced that the Dawson disappearance was connected to the violent underworld that Prohibition had created in the Ozarks. But despite their efforts, the investigators were unable to piece together a coherent picture of what had happened to the family or who might have been responsible for their fate. The scattered evidence painted a picture of a crime that had been both carefully planned and brutally executed. The fact that personal items belonging to each member of the family had been found in different locations suggested that the Dawsons had been separated, possibly while still alive. The condition of some of the items, the burned blanket, the smashed jar, the carefully arranged shoes, suggested that psychological torture might have been involved, as if the perpetrators had taken pleasure in creating a trail of mysterious clues. Local residents began to report other strange phenomena that might or might not have been connected to the Dawson disappearance. Several people claimed to have seen lights moving through the forest at night, lights that could not be explained by any normal human activity. Others reported hearing voices calling in the darkness, voices that seemed to be crying for help, but that fell silent whenever anyone approached. A traveling preacher named Reverend Isaiah Mills, who had been conducting revival meetings throughout the region, declared that the Dawson disappearance was a sign of divine judgment, a warning to the community about the evil that was spread. Ding through the mountains, his sermons drew large crowds of people who were desperate for some explanation, any explanation, for the terrible events that had shattered their sense of security. But even as the community struggled to make sense of what had happened, the evidence continued to accumulate in ways that seemed almost designed to maximize fear and uncertainty. It was as if whoever had been responsible for the Dawsons' fate wanted to ensure that their crime would never be forgotten, that it would continue to haunt the region long after the official investigation had been abandoned. The strange discoveries and their implications began to transform the very character of life in the Ozarks, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affected every aspect of daily existence. Parents kept their children closer to home, rarely allowing them to play in the woods that had once been considered safe. Farmers began carrying weapons when they worked in remote fields, and families started locking their doors at night, a practice that had been virtually unknown in a region where trust and mutual support had been the foundation of community life. As the autumn of 1922 deepened into winter, the investigation into the Dawson family disappearance began to focus more intensively on the human element of the crime. Sheriff Kelly, working with federal agents and investigators from the Missouri State Police, developed several theories about what might have happened and who might have been responsible for the family's fate. The most compelling theory centered on the illegal liquor trade that had become such a dominant force in the Ozark economy. Federal agents had identified at least a dozen major moonshine operations within a 20-mile radius of the Dawson farm, and they knew that these operations were protected by networks of criminals who were capable of extreme violence when their interests were threatened. According to this theory, the Dawsons had accidentally encountered one of these operations during their picnic outing, possibly discovering a still or witnessing a transaction that they weren't supposed to see. The moonshiners, fearing that the family would report what they had observed to the authorities, had decided to eliminate the witnesses. The elaborate disposal of evidence and the careful placement of personal items throughout the region were seen as attempts to create confusion and misdirect the investigation. This theory was supported by several pieces of circumstantial evidence. The area where the Dawsons had disappeared was known to be a corridor used by bootleggers to transport their products to markets in Springfield and other larger cities. Several residents of the region had reported seeing unfamiliar men in the area during the weeks preceding the disappearance, men who claimed to be timber cruisers or traveling salesmen, but whose activities suggested other purposes. Most significantly, federal agents had been conducting an intensive investigation of moonshine operations in the region during the summer of 1922, and they had made several arrests in the weeks immediately before the Dawson disappearance. This law enforcement pressure had made the criminals increasingly paranoid and violent, creating conditions where innocent people might easily be mistaken for threats that needed to be eliminated. The federal agents involved in the investigation were particularly interested in a man known only as Black Pete, who was believed to be one of the most ruthless operators in the regional bootlegging network. Black Pete was rumored to have been responsible for several other disappearances in the Ozarks, including that of a federal informant who had vanished the previous year. He was known to use extreme violence as a tool for intimidating rivals and potential witnesses, and his operations were believed to include not just moonshine production, but also robbery, extortion, and murder. But despite intensive efforts to locate Black Pete and his associates, the investigators were unable to develop enough evidence to support charges in connection with the Dawson disappearance. The criminal networks that controlled the illegal liquor trade were sophisticated and well organized, with elaborate systems for protecting their members from law enforcement penetration. Witnesses were intimidated into silence, evidence was destroyed or hidden, and those who might have information about specific crimes were often eliminated before they could be questioned. Another theory that gained credence among investigators focused on the possibility that the Dawsons had been victims of a robbery gone wrong. The family was known to have had some money with them. Edward had recently sold a load of timber and was carrying the proceeds to deposit in the bank in Mountain View. It was possible that criminals had targeted the family specifically for this money, intending to rob them but deciding to eliminate them as witnesses when the crime escalated beyond their original intentions. This robbery theory was supported by reports from several sources that strangers had been asking questions about the Dawson family in the weeks before their disappearance. A merchant in Mountain View reported that 2 men had inquired about Edward's recent timber sale, asking specific questions about how much money he had received and when he might be traveling with the proceeds. Similar reports came from other businesses in the area, suggesting that the family had been under surveillance before their final outing. The federal agents also considered the possibility that the Dawson disappearance was connected to broader patterns of violence that were affecting rural communities throughout the Midwest during the early 1920s. The economic disruption that had followed World War I had created conditions, too, that favored criminal activity, while the social upheaval of the period had weakened traditional community structures that had once provided protection against such crimes. There were reports of similar family disappearances in other parts of Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma during this period, suggesting that organized criminal groups might have been operating across state lines. Some of these groups were believed to specialize in targeting isolated farming families, who were seen as easy victims with limited protection from law enforcement. The remoteness of the Ozark region, combined with the limited resources of local law enforcement agencies, made it an ideal hunting ground for such predators. But even as investigators developed these theories and pursued various leads, they were hampered by the same factors that had limited the effectiveness of the original search efforts. The vast wilderness of the Ozarks provided countless places where evidence could be hidden or destroyed, while the tight-knit but secretive nature of local communities made it difficult for outsiders to obtain reliable information about criminal activities. The investigation was further complicated by the climate of suspicion and mistrust that prohibition enforcement had created throughout the region. Many local residents viewed federal agents with deep suspicion, seeing them as representatives of an illegitimate authority that was attempting to impose its will on traditional ways of life. This mistrust made it difficult for investigators to obtain cooperation from witnesses who might have had crucial information about the Dawson disappearance. At the same time, the criminal networks that controlled illegal activities in the region had developed sophisticated methods for protecting themselves from law enforcement investigation. They used codes and signals to communicate, maintained multiple safety houses and hideouts throughout the wilderness, and employed violence and intimidation to ensure the silence of anyone who might threaten their operations. As winter settled over the Ozarks, the formal investigation into the Dawson disappearance began to wind down, though it was never officially closed. Sheriff Kelly and the federal agents involved continued to pursue leads as they developed, but the trail had grown cold and new evidence was becoming increasingly rare. The case joined the growing file of unsolved crimes that reflected the lawless character of the region during the Prohibition era. But while the official investigation might have been scaling back, the search for answers continued in other forms, driven by the testimonies of local residents who claimed to have witnessed events that might be connected to the Dawson family's fate. These eyewitness accounts, collected over the months following the disappearance, painted a picture of a region where the boundary between the natural and supernatural had become dangerously blurred. One of the most significant accounts came from Samuel Morrison, a farmer whose property bordered the area where the Dawsons had vanished. Morrison claimed that on the evening of July 15th, the same day the family had disappeared, he had seen unusual activity near Jack's Fork River. According to his testimony, he had been working in his fields when he noticed smoke rising from the direction of the river, far more smoke than would be produced by a normal campfire. Morrison's curiosity had been aroused, and he had made his way toward the source of the smoke, following a deer trail that led through the dense forest. As he approached the river, he began to hear voices, not the casual conversation he might have expected from campers or picnickers, but what sounded like shouting and argument. The voices were too distant for him to make out specific words, but the tone suggested conflict and anger. But what Morrison saw when he finally reached a vantage point overlooking the river valley would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the trees, he could see a group of men gathered around what appeared to be a large fire. The men were not local residents. Morrison knew virtually everyone in the area, and their behavior suggested that they were engaged in some kind of criminal activity. They moved with the quick, nervous gestures of people who were afraid of being discovered, constantly looking around as if watching for approaching danger. Most disturbing of all, Morrison claimed to have seen what looked like figures lying on the ground near the fire, figures that appeared to be bound and motionless. The distance and the smoke from the fire made it impossible for him to see clearly, but he was convinced that he was witnessing some kind of violent crime. He wanted to intervene, but he was alone and unarmed, facing what appeared to be a group of dangerous criminals. Morrison retreated from his vantage point and made his way home, intending to contact Sheriff Kelly and report what he had seen. But by the time he reached his house, darkness had fallen, and there was no way to contact the sheriff until morning. When Morrison returned to the area the next day with a group of neighbors, they found only the cold ashes of a large fire and disturbed ground that suggested some kind of struggle had taken place. Morrison's account was treated seriously by investigators, particularly because it provided a potential timeline for what had happened to the Dawson family. If his observations were accurate, they suggested that the family had been captured and taken to a location near the river, where they had been murdered and their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace for searchers to find. But Morrison's testimony also raised questions that investigators were unable to answer. Who were the men he had seen? How had they managed to capture an entire family without leaving any evidence of a struggle at the original picnic site? And how had they disposed of 4 bodies so completely that no trace could be found despite intensive searching? Another significant eyewitness account came from a woman named Martha Hensley, who lived with her family in a cabin about 3 miles from the Dawson farm. Martha claimed that on the night following the family's disappearance, she had been awakened by the sound of voices calling in the darkness outside her home. The voices seemed to be crying for help, and she was convinced that one of them belonged to a child. Martha had awakened her husband, and together they had listened to the voices, which seemed to be coming from the forest behind their cabin. The calls continued for several minutes, sometimes growing louder and sometimes fading away, as if the speakers were moving through the woods. Martha's husband had wanted to investigate, but Martha had persuaded him to wait until morning, fearing that they might be walking into a trap. When they searched the area the next day, they found no sign of anyone having been there. But Martha remained convinced that she had heard Margaret Dawson calling for help, and her testimony added to the growing belief in the community that the family had not died quickly or easily. The possibility that they had been held captive for some time before being killed was particularly disturbing to local residents, who began to imagine the terror that the family must have experienced. A third significant eyewitness account came from a man named Jacob White, who operated a grist mill on Current River. White claimed that about a week after the Dawson disappearance, 2 strangers had come to his mill in the middle of the night, demanding that he grind corn for them immediately. The men were heavily armed and clearly nervous, and they offered to pay far more than the job was worth. Always a sign of criminal activity in the region. While White was processing their grain, he overheard the men talking about events that seemed to be connected to the Daws on Disappearance. They mentioned a family that had seen too much and had to be taken care of, and they made references to bodies being hidden in places where they would never be found. One of the men made a comment about children's shoes that particularly disturbed White, though he was unable to hear the complete context of the remark. White was afraid to ask questions or to appear too interested in the men's conversation, but he tried to memorize as much as possible about their appearance and their comments. He described them later as rough-looking men who spoke with accents that suggested they were not from the local area. They left before dawn, taking their ground corn with them and disappearing into the wilderness as suddenly as they had appeared. When White reported this encounter to Sheriff Kelly, it provided the first direct evidence that the Dawson disappearance might have been the work of organized criminals from outside the immediate area. The references to hiding bodies and to children's shoes seemed to confirm that the strangers had been involved in the family's murder, but the information came too late to be of immediate use in tracking down the perpetrators. These and other eyewitness accounts began to create a picture of a crime that had been both carefully planned and brutally executed by criminals who were familiar with the region, but not part of the local community. The testimonies suggested that the Dawsons had been targeted specifically, possibly because they had inadvertently learned something that threatened criminal operations in the area. But the eyewitness accounts also revealed the climate of fear that had settled over the region in the aftermath of the disappearance. People who might once have investigated strange sounds or unusual activities now barricaded themselves in their homes, afraid that they might become the next victims of whatever force had claimed the Dawson family. The sense of community that had once characterized life in the Ozarks was being eroded by suspicion and terror. Some residents reported seeing lights moving through the forest at night, lights that followed no pattern consistent with normal human activity. Others claimed to have heard the sound of wagons moving along remote trails in the darkness, wagons that left no tracks that could be found in daylight. There were reports of strange smells emanating from certain areas of the forest, smells that suggested decomposition, but that could never be traced to their source. Children began to report seeing ghost people in the woods, figures that appeared to be the Dawson family members, still wearing the clothes they had worn on their final picnic. These sightings were usually dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations, but they occurred with such frequency and consistency that some adults began to wonder if there might be some truth to them. The accumulation of these reports created an atmosphere in which the line between reality and superstition became increasingly blurred. People who had once prided themselves on their practical, down-to-earth approach to life found themselves believing in possibilities that they would have scoffed at just months earlier. The Dawson disappearance had opened a crack in the rational world of the Ozarks, and through that crack, older and darker possibilities were beginning to seep back into consciousness. As the first anniversary of the Dawson disappearance approached, it became clear that the case would never be solved in any conventional sense. The family had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the gradual transformation of their story from current event to local legend. But this transformation did not diminish the impact of their disappearance. If anything, it intensified the hold that their story had on the imagination of the region. The process by which the Dawson disappearance evolved from a criminal investigation into a piece of regional folklore was gradual but inexorable. As the months passed, and the official investigation yielded no answers, people began to develop their own explanations for what had happened, explanations that drew on older traditions of storytelling and belief that had deep roots in Ozark culture. Some residents began to interpret the disappearance through the lens of supernatural explanation, suggesting that the family had encountered forces that existed beyond the normal world of cause and effect. These interpretations drew on a rich tradition of Ozark folklore that included stories of mysterious disappearances, supernatural entities, and places where the normal rules of reality did not apply. The location where the Dawsons had vanished already had a reputation for strangeness that predated their disappearance. Local Cherokee traditions spoke of the area as a place where the spirits of the dead lingered, unable or unwilling to move on to whatever lay beyond this world. Earlier European settlers had reported unusual phenomena in the region: lights that appeared in the forest with no apparent source, sounds that seemed to come from empty air, and a persistent sense of being watched by unseen observers. These older stories began to resurface in the wake of the Dawson disappearance, creating a narrative framework that could accommodate the inexplicable aspects of the case. If the area had always been a place where strange things happened, then perhaps the family's vanishing was simply the latest manifestation of forces that had been active in the region for generations. The folk interpretation of the Dawson disappearance was reinforced by the discovery of additional evidence that seemed to support supernatural explanations. Hunters and travelers began to report finding personal items that belonged to the family in locations that should have been impossible for them to reach. Margaret's hair ribbon was found tied to a tree branch that was more than 20 feet off the ground, with no indication of how it could have gotten there. Harold's pocket knife was discovered embedded in a rock face in a way that suggested it had been thrown with impossible force. These discoveries defied rational explanation, leading many people to conclude that the Dawsons had indeed encountered something beyond the normal world of human experience. The fact that official investigators were unable to solve the case seemed to confirm that conventional methods of understanding were inadequate to deal with what had happened. As the story of the Dawson disappearance spread beyond the immediate region, it began to attract the attention of people who specialized in investigating unusual phenomena. Researchers interested in unexplained disappearances, supernatural occurrences, and regional folklore made pilgrimages to the Ozarks to study the case and to interview local residents who claimed to have information about what had happened. Some of these investigators proposed theories that were even more exotic than those developed by local residents. They suggested that the Dawsons might have encountered extraterrestrial beings, or that they had somehow slipped through a rift in time and space that had transported them to another dimension. While these theories seemed far-fetched to most local residents, they added to the growing reputation of the case as something that transcended ordinary criminal activity. The transformation of the Dawson disappearance into folklore was also encouraged by the way the story was told and retold throughout the region. Each telling added new details, new interpretations, and new embellishments that gradually transformed the factual account into something richer and more complex. The story became a kind of collective creation, shaped by the fears, hopes, and imagination of everyone who contributed to its development. Parents began to use the story of the Dawsons as a cautionary tale, warning their children about the dangers of wandering too far from home or exploring unfamiliar areas without adult supervision. The family's fate became a symbol of the vulnerability that characterized life in the wilderness, a reminder that civilization was a thin veneer that could be stripped away at any moment by forces beyond human control. The story also became a way for the community to process the broader anxieties that characterized life in the 1920s. The Dawson disappearance occurred during a period of rapid social change when traditional ways of life were being challenged by modernization, urbanization, and new forms of federal authority. The family's vanishing became a metaphor for the loss of innocence and security that many people felt as their world was transformed by forces they could not understand or control. Local businesses began to capitalize on the growing reputation of the Dawson case, offering guided tours of the area where the family had disappeared and selling souvenirs related to the story. Hotels and boarding houses advertised their proximity to the mystery location, and restaurants featured Dawson family specials on their menus. What had begun as a tragedy was gradually being transformed into a tourist attraction. But even as the story became commercialized, it retained its power to disturb and fascinate. People who visited the area where the Dawsons had vanished often reported feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, as if the location itself had been permanently marked by the terrible events that had occurred there. Many visitors claimed to experience unusual phenomena during their trips: strange sounds, unexplained lights, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen observers. The annual anniversary of the disappearance became an unofficial observance in the region, marked by newspaper articles, community gatherings, and renewed speculation about what had happened to the family. These anniversary observances helped to keep the story alive in public consciousness and ensured that new generations would continue to be fascinated by the mystery. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, and the immediate circumstances that had surrounded the Dawson disappearance faded into history, the story began to take on a life of its own that was independent of its origins in actual events. The family became legendary figures, their story told and retold in countless variations that reflected the evolving concerns and interests of the people who kept their memory alive. But even as the story evolved and changed, certain core elements remained constant. The image of the perfectly preserved picnic site, the mysterious discovery of personal items throughout the region, and the complete absence of the family members themselves continued to capture the imagination of everyone who heard the tale. These elements seem to speak to something fundamental about the human condition: the fragility of life, the persistence of mystery, and the power of the unknown to intrude into even the most ordinary circumstances. Today, more than a century after the Dawson family vanished into the mists of the Ozark Mountains, their story continues to resonate with a power that seems to grow rather than diminish with the passage of time. The hills and valleys where they disappeared remain largely unchanged, still covered with the same dense forests, still threaded with the same clear streams, still harboring the same hidden places where secrets can be buried beyond the reach of human discovery. Modern investigators, equipped with technologies that were unimaginable in 1922, have occasion. Ally attempted to solve the mystery that defeated their predecessors. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to search for burial sites. Advanced forensic techniques have been applied to the few pieces of physical evidence that remain, and criminal profilers have developed new theories about what might have motivated the crime. But the wilderness has kept its secrets well, yielding nothing that could definitively explain what happened to Edward, Lillian, Harold, and Margaret Dawson on that perfect summer day so long ago. The area where the family disappeared has become a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by unsolved mysteries, drawing visitors from around the world who come to walk the same trails, stand beside the same river, and try to imagine what might have occurred in this peaceful setting. Many of these visitors report experiencing phenomena that seem to echo the original mystery: unexplained sounds, unusual lights, and the persistent sense that they are not alone in the wilderness. Local residents have learned to live with their famous mystery, incorporating it into their sense of regional identity while continuing to debate what really happened to the Dawson family. Some maintain that the case will eventually be solved through advances in investigative technology or the discovery of new evidence. Others believe that the mystery is destined to remain unsolved, that some secrets are simply too well hidden to ever be revealed. The story has inspired countless retellings in books, articles, television programs, and internet forums, each generation finding new ways to interpret the events of that summer day in 1922. Some focus on the criminal aspects of the case, trying to identify the perpetrators and understand their motives. Others emphasize the supernatural elements, treating the disappearance as evidence of forces that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Dawson mystery is not the question of what happened to the family, but what their story reveals about the nature of mystery itself. In an age when we have become accustomed to having answers to our questions, when technology seems capable of solving any puzzle and explaining any phenomenon, the Dawson disappearance reminds us that there are still some secrets that resist all our efforts to understand them. The family's story speaks to our deepest fears about the fragility of the normal world, about how quickly the familiar can become strange and the safe can become dangerous. It reminds us that beneath the surface of our ordered lives, there are currents of mystery and possibility that we rarely acknowledge but can never completely escape. In the end, the Dawson family has achieved a kind of immortality through their mysterious fate. They have become more than just victims of an unsolved crime. They have become symbols of the unknown, representatives of all the questions that we cannot answer and all the mysteries that continue to surround us. Their story continues to be told because it touches something fundamental in the human psyche: our need to understand what we cannot understand, our compulsion to seek answers, even when no answers are to be found. The picnic that never ended has become a reminder that in this vast and complex world, there are still places where the impossible can happen, where families can vanish into thin air, and where the wilderness keeps its secrets as effectively as it always has. The Dawson mystery endures because it represents something that we have not lost despite all our technological advances and scientific discoveries: our capacity to be amazed, frightened, and humbled by the unknown. And so the story continues, passed down from generation to generation, embellished and modified with each telling, but never losing its essential power to disturb and fascinate. In the mist-covered hollows of the Ozark Mountains, where the morning fog still rises from hidden valleys and the sound of distant laughter sometimes echoes through the trees, the mystery of the Dawson family lives on, as fresh and compelling today as it was on that summer afternoon in 1922, when 4 people walked into the wilderness and disappeared forever into the realm of legend. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.